So just an overview of my talk. I'm going to talk about the problem we're trying to address with cancer drug funding. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about the Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review and the process that's used to make decisions about cancer drugs in Canada, and then sum up with some strengths and critiques of the peak order process in cancer drug funding in Canada. So I'm going to start with a couple of cases. This is a 65-year-old man who had surgery to remove a melanoma, a malignant skin cancer. And we know that that can be cured with surgery alone. But we also know that through randomized clinical trials, that getting an immunotherapy drug called pembrolizumab for 1 year can improve the outcome and improve the cure rate. And we know that for men like this who receive, or people like this who receive pembrolizumab after melanoma surgery, the cure rate at 5 years without treatment is 38%. But if you receive pembrolizumab for a year, you actually have a cure rate of 5 years. So a big improvement in the cure rate with this drug. So I'm going to actually get some audience involvement here. And I'm going to ask you, for this drug that improves the cure rate of melanoma, about 17% at 5-year cure rate, I'm going to ask you, what's the most you would pay for this drug? Okay, so for the 1 year treatment. So how many people would pay at most $1,000? Okay, there we go, one person. Who would pay at most $10,000 for a year of treatment? Okay, so we have a good group there. And who would pay at most $100,000 for this treatment? Have a few there. Okay, so in fact, this costs about $100,000 for this course of therapy. So I'm going to talk about another case. 65-year-old woman. I'm a GI medical oncologist. And I treat metastatic colorectal cancer, and we've made great advances through randomized clinical trials in the last 20 years. Metastatic colorectal cancer is incurable, but we have a very good chemotherapy and biologic therapies. For this particular type of metastatic colorectal cancer, this woman received treatment with different types of chemotherapy, but after 18 months, her tumors were progressing and she was feeling worse. So there is a drug called trifluridine tipiracil. It's a chemotherapy drug. And this drug doesn't cure cancer, but it can improve length of survival. So if you get, again, this is from a large randomized trial where trifluridine tipiracil was compared to placebo. The average survival without treatment was just over 5 months. The average survival with, with treatment is 7.1 months. So less than 2 months improvement on average on how long these folks lived. If you looked at tumor shrinkage, only 1.6% of people had a major shrinkage in their tumor. About 44% had stabilization of their tumor. This does have some major side effects, including fatigue and lowering white blood cell counts and increasing risk of infection. And in fact, there was no part of the study that actually measured quality of life. It's also another important patient outcome. So I'm going to ask you again, how much would you pay at most per month for this medication? Okay, less than 2 month median overall survival event, 1.6% tumor response rate. Who would pay at most $25 a month for this? Okay, so we have a few responses for that. Who would pay at most $250 a month? There were a lot of people coming in there. And who would pay up to $2,500 a month for this drug? And we don't have anybody there. And in fact, this drug costs about $2,500 a month, and that's after significant discounting. The list price is about $6,000 a month. So I wanted to do this to tell you a bit about the problem we're trying to address. And you can see that from the 1970s into the 2000s, this is the monthly and median cost of cancer drugs. This is US data, but it's very similar in Canada. And you can see that in the 1970s, the monthly costs were about $100. But over time and into the 2000s, those have crept up to the tens of thousands of dollars per month. If you look at Ontario public drug programs, and this is spending on cancer drugs, you can see that the average annual growth rate is 11%. And compared to growth in the total health sector, it's much higher, over 11% for cancer drugs, 2% growth rate in the total health sector. This is a drug from some colleagues of ours in the US. They looked at all 51 cancer drugs approved at the US Food and Drug Administration between 2009 and 2013. And what they found is there was no significant relationship between the cost of the drug and the percentage improvement in how long people lived. So there was no relation between the cost of the drug and the value in terms of the meaningful benefit for patients in terms of how long they live. And they concluded that their results suggested that the current pricing models are not rational, i.e. value for money, more pay for more output, but simply reflect what the market will bear. So the problem we have is that new cancer drugs can be very effective. That example of pembrolizumab and melanoma not only increases cure rate for people who've had surgery for curative melanoma, but produces very meaningful results for people who have metastatic and previously incurable melanoma, but now curable. New cancer drugs are expensive. They account for a large component of healthcare spending, and spending continues to grow. However, many of the new agents provide only modest benefits despite substantial costs. And given that we have constrained healthcare resources in every health system, whether we have high-income country or low and middle-income country, decisions need to be made regarding which of these drugs should be funded, because obviously cancer drugs aren't the only drugs we need to fund. We need to fund other drugs for other illnesses. We need to have other expenditures in our country for other important things like education, et cetera. So societies have to make rational decisions about how they're going to spend their money. And obviously drug funding and allocating constrained resources is complex. It includes looking at scientific evidence, and Dr. Dancy's talk gave a very good overview of how we generate that type of evidence. It includes economics and cost effectiveness of how we judge the value of these drugs. It includes ethical issues like fairness and equity, and that's one of my particular areas of interest. And it includes political issues. I mean, these are major political issues for governments. And Canadian Oncology Drug Review is a very robust system that we have in Canada for making these types of decisions. And you can see that there are a number of underlying tenets: good governance, health system focus, excellence, evidence-based. But I'm going to be talking mostly about, or a little bit of focus on the ethical framework. How do we make sure that these decisions are fair and justified? And when we talk about legitimacy and fairness, we think about under what conditions should society grant authority to individuals or institutions to set limits to healthcare. This is an ethical framework called accountability for reasonableness. I'm not going to talk about the details of that, but they make the point that there's a couple of really important principles here. One is publicity, that there should be transparency in decision making, and that those decisions should be communicated well, and that those decisions should be relevant, that the appropriate people are making the decisions, and they're based on rationales that are reasonable and justified. I'm going to go through a little bit more detail. So in terms of transparency, anybody can go on to the Canadian Oncology Drug Review decision-making website. This is part of the Canada's Drug and Health Technology Agency, CADTH, and you can find out exactly how they made funding decisions. So in fact, Keytruda or pembrolizumab was funded for melanoma. Trifluridine and Tipiracil for metastatic colorectal cancer wasn't funded, and I'll tell you a little bit more. You can go and find out how those decisions were made in great detail. What I think Decoder doesn't do very well, and an essential part of communication, is not only transparency, but was the decision and its rationale communicated effectively. These decisions are communicated to health professionals, but I don't think they do a great job of communicating it to the public at large. Another key point is relevance, and this includes both involving the right people and using the right rationales for those decisions. And in terms of people, some of the important questions to consider are: have you identified the appropriate people, who the appropriate people are to make decisions, and how you include them in decision making? And were any people missing from the decision making? So I'm going to change gears a little bit and talk about the evolution of drug funding in Canada and how things have gone. So Dr. Pater was not only the director, one of the inaugural director of the Canadian Cancer Trials Group, but was also involved in one of the early drug funding bodies actually in the world, This was through the provincial agency Cancer Care Ontario. And he chaired the policy advisory committee on the new drug funding program. And this was the first group that was set up to say, have new and expensive drugs. This was set up to deal with a drug that was quite, or considered to be quite expensive at the time, a drug called paclitaxel, but it went on to make many further decisions. That evolved into another provincial agency called the Committee to Evaluate Drugs, Cancer Care Ontario Subcommittee. And the key thing there in terms of involving the right people was this was the first time that lay people and patients were added as observers. They weren't formally involved, but they were added as observers at that point. And then in 2011, the Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review was established. And I think that two important points about that. One, it was the first time where lay people and cancer patients and caregivers were actually included as part of the decision making. And it was also the first time we had a national drug funding body. Up until that point, all of the provinces were making individualized decisions. And this was Dr. Tony Fields, who was the inaugural director of the Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review and brought together a national body, all provinces except Quebec, to try and make these decisions. I'm going to go briefly through how this process works. Once a new drug has gone through a big randomized clinical trial, usually a drug company that's run that trial will submit it. Others can do it, but it's generally drug companies. At that point, there's input from provincial advisory groups like Cancer Care Ontario. Patients are involved here, and patient advocacy groups can provide input on the submission at that time, and clinicians can make input at that time. After that, there is rigorous clinical review of the evidence and the trials that were used to make to support the use of that drug. And an economic team goes over how much the drug costs and how much the drug costs relative to the meaningful benefits to patients. Finally, it comes to a group called the PCODER Expert Review Committee, and I was fortunate to be an inaugural member of this group and was the ethics advisor. And based on the input from the advisory groups, the clinical and economic teams, they make an initial recommendation. After that, my slide's not working properly. It actually goes for further feedback from those groups, and a final recommendation is made. And I think that not only are patient advocacy groups involved in advising both prior to and after the initial decision, but they're now patient members on the PCODER Expert Review Committee. Here's some of them here. Val has served on that committee and will be giving her perspective soon. So the other part of relevance, other than people, is rationales. And the PCODER Expert Review Committee, the PERC, the deliberative framework, what are the rationales we should make for these decisions? One is overall clinical benefit, alignment with patient values, cost effectiveness or value for money, and feasibility of implementation. I think you'll all agree these are the kind of things that we want to look at. Overall clinical benefit is, do these drugs work? And is there good evidence that they work? So they look at efficacy. Is there good evidence that this medication improves outcomes that are important to patients, including cure rate, length of life, and quality of life? And how does that measure, and how does that balance against the side effects that these medications cause? And overall clinical benefit is a balance between the effectiveness and the side effects. So just as an example, for a trifluridine tiprazole, they looked at the evidence and they saw there was inconsistency between the different trials that were run. There was only a potentially modest improvement, less than on average 2 months of life. Moderate side effects, which I've talked about, and they did not do a very good job. In fact, didn't measure prospectively how this impacted the quality of patients' life. Cost effectiveness, we have health economists who look at value for money. This generally looks at dollars spent on the drug, how that relates to the meaningful benefits for patients. This is usually measured in dollars per life year or quality adjusted life year. And there's usually a threshold of about $100,000 for quality adjusted life year. Dr. Giawali supervised a group who looked at this, the PCODER decisions, and of the 104 drugs evaluated in the decade from when the PCODER started, 69% of the drugs were effective, but not cost effective. Had to go on to have their doses, their prices negotiated down. In terms of alignment with patient values and feasibility of implementation, just an example again with trifluridine tipiracil, that drug for metastatic colorectal cancer. This is an oral medication, and they took into account that this aligned well with patient values in terms of convenience. But in fact, in terms of deliberating and thinking about how overall balance, this did not overcome the fact that the medication only provided modest benefits and significant side effects. So P-CODER does have a lot of strengths. They have strong scientific rationales, economic rationales, and they have a strong ethical and deliberative framework. They have clearly articulated decision-making principles and process. It's a very transparent process, and you can go on and find in detail how these decisions are made. There's an involvement of a wide group of stakeholders, including lay and patient representatives, and meaningful involvement of those representatives. And I think all of these features enhance the legitimacy and fairness of the process. I think the other thing is that the collective involvement of 9 provinces backed by a robust process provides a good position to negotiate the lowest drug price. Previously, all the provinces negotiated. In terms of need for improvements, I think they could do better at communicating their decisions. Parts of the process after the review remain opaque. Once a drug is deemed not cost-effective, it goes to something called the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Allowance. We don't know how they negotiate the prices. It's a big black box. The other thing is that P-CODER makes decisions on both intravenous drugs and oral drugs. And universally across the country, intravenous drugs you get in the cancer clinic or in hospital, have a universal funding mechanism. If you look at oral and subcutaneous drugs, there are vastly different rules across the country. In the Western provinces, most oral and subcutaneous cancer drugs are funded by their provincial Ministry of Health. As you know, in Ontario, they're funded for people under 25 or over 65, but people between 25 and 65 generally have to pay or have insurance for oral and subcutaneous. Finally, the other finding from the study that Dr. Giawali was involved in pointed out that although P-CODER takes into account the magnitude of clinical benefit, only half of the cancer drugs that received a positive recommendation had improved length of life, and that the gains were usually modest. So only half actually improved length of life, modest. And they concluded that these results suggest that although P-CODER helps filter out some cancer drugs with low quality of evidence and low magnitude of benefit, the cancer drugs without meaningful patient benefit continue to enter the patient market. Despite these critiques, there's a lot of strengths, and I think it just brings back Winston Churchill's comments on democracy, that indeed has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. And I think that in fact, the Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review is a very robust, very strong, room for improvement, but actually one of the strongest drug funding agencies for cancer drugs in the world. I'll be happy to take questions after Val has had a chance to speak.
And as Scott said, I was a patient member of the Canadian Oncology Drug Review Expert Review Committee. And I have to say, it took me about 6 months to learn all of the acronyms that are used in the world, because it was a brand new world for me. I'm actually an English history grad of Queen's, and so they say there's a steep learning curve to join a committee like that. I would say it was more like a wall, learning how to scale a wall. But I would like to talk about my experience in particular with that committee. I was on the committee mainly initially because of my role as caregiver. 2 of my 3 daughters were treated for cancer when they were children. And then much later, I was also the primary caregiver for my father-in-law, who had lots and lots of health conditions, including 3 different types of cancer. And then most recently, I became a cancer patient myself, being diagnosed with stage 3 melanoma, one of the lucky people to be offered pembrolizumab, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. So all of those experiences, despite my arts background, led me to be involved in a number of different health organizations, either through Sick Kids initially, and then gradually out into the wider world. And so today, as you heard, I'm going to talk about my experience with PERC. So basically, what I'd like to go over is, why is it important to engage patients in the drug approval and reimbursement process? You'll hear a little bit more about development and clinical trials, but Scott went over some of those reasons already. And I'll talk a bit more in depth about how and when patient input is incorporated into the reviews, and then specifically what happens at PERC. What role do patient members have? And then I'll provide an example of how that looked in practice. And then talk about some of the concerns about the process from a patient point of view, and challenges and supports that CADF provides for the patient groups. And then I'll circle back to the whole question of cost. So why engage patients? There is increasing consensus that engaging patients in research and the development of medicine has benefits for stakeholders because you find out what it is that patients actually need. It's also ethical. And it may ensure that the trial outcomes and patient-reported outcomes are relevant and meaningful and have value to those who use the new treatments. But there is less agreement on involving them in the decision-making, particularly around complex technologies like CAR-T. However, it's generally accepted that patient engagement helps the process become transparent, as you heard, and also can add some meaning to the decision-making and improve the quality of the decisions. So patient perspective can add meaning to the whole process because patients can provide information and context about the impact of the illness and the impact of current treatment. They can talk about things like why an oral treatment might be valued over an IV treatment, especially for example, someone living in a rural area or someone who's older and finds it more difficult to travel. They may address issues around unmet needs. Perhaps there are no treatments after a certain number of treatments have happened, or perhaps the existing treatment is particularly toxic. Just having trouble scrolling here. Thank you. And also, there's a whole question of expectations and trade-offs. So what is it that patients are actually looking for? And then sometimes there are trade-offs. Sometimes, as you heard, the outcomes might be modest, but then there are it can be balanced against things like a less toxic treatment. And patients often do have experience of the new treatment that might be shed a different kind of light on the actual treatment than clinical trial. Because the patients recruited for clinical trials may in fact be healthier than patients in real life, and they may have a different experience of what's actually happening. So how and when are patients involved? You heard a little bit about that. CADF, PCODER, invite patient participation. Patient groups who are registered with CADF, and they're invited to make a submission about a particular drug when it comes up for review. And they are given resources from CADF in terms of support from the patient engagement team. There are resources on the website, there are templates, there are guides. They occasionally offer support, occasionally permit patients to attend the CADF symposium where they can actually learn more about the process. The input from the patient evidence is incorporated into all of the clinical reports that go to the expert review committee and into the economic guidance reports. PERC members may go back and forth with the patient groups. They may ask for clarification about some of the detail just to make sure that we understand. We don't actually have direct contact with the patient groups, so they go through the CADF staff. And then during the patient meeting, PERC meetings, one of the 3 patient members presents a summary to the committee, although everyone on the committee would read the patient input. And then during the deliberations at PERC, patient input is considered, as you saw, as one of the 4 quadrants that we consider. And it's important to note that none of those, there's no ranking, there's no sense of, okay, patient values are more important than something else. Although generally, if clinical evidence is really poor, it's kind of a done deal, although we don't generally see something so extreme. But it is weighed equally with all of the other quadrants. And then what I think what's very interesting is the patient groups are also invited to provide feedback on the initial recommendation. And until recently, they could also request a reconsideration of that decision. They can no longer request a reconsideration. Only the manufacturers are permitted to do that now, but they can say they object or they feel that we've overlooked something, and their feedback is taken into account if PERC does reconsider a decision that was made. And in terms of acknowledging contributions, which is part of the publicity, the patient input is always summarized in the reports, and it's summarized in the final recommendation and the initial recommendation. And more recently, CADIF has started to publish kind of a summary of how patient input was used in the report, and that's published on their website. And I think that's an attempt to provide a bit more information about two patient groups in particular, but it's also available to the public. So in terms of my experience on PERC, there are 3 patient members, as you heard. I say hello to Daryl Bell, who I know is online, and he is one of the current members. We're chosen because we have personal experience with cancer, and we have some understanding of the treatment and care of cancer. The terms last for 2 or 3 years, and they can be renewed. And we attend the monthly full day. They were in-person meetings, now they're online. And all members of PERC receive an honorarium, and the patient members receive the same honorarium as the professional members, which is actually pretty unusual, I have to say. Judy and I were talking about the health committees we're on, and we're generally always volunteers. But we are treated as full members, and we have the same responsibilities and voting rights as the other members, and the same expectation to read and absorb all of the material. In my experience, it was one of the most respectful and inclusive experiences I've had on any kind of health committee. And I would say that that comes from the top, from the design of the coder, and also from the leadership and from the other members. So it's a very interesting experience. So just going back to the example of trifluridine to Pyrasil, how this would have worked through from a patient perspective. As Scott pointed out, it's a very expensive drug with inconsistent results, modest benefit. However, there was an unmet need. So for that particular drug, we received one submission from a patient group called Colorectal Cancer Canada. And so I believe I actually presented this. So I read over all the information, prepared a summary of what they had said. And in this example, they found 118 respondents, including almost, I think it was 27 patients who actually had experience with the therapy, which can be unusual. So they did an awful lot of work to make this presentation. The kind of information that they added to our discussion was that they found out about the impact of the illness, the current treatment. In particular, many of the patients had used all possible lines of treatment, and so there was an unmet need for those who'd exhausted standard of care therapies. They were looking in particular for a treatment that was less toxic, and they wanted an oral option. And so they also went to great lengths to survey patients about what kinds of trade-offs they were willing to make for certain kinds of outcomes. And they also looked at experience of new treatment. As I said, they found 27 patients who'd had the treatment. In terms of expectations, they wanted a therapy that would control their disease with respect to overall survival, progression-free survival, and promote quality of life during their lifetime, even if the therapy didn't extend overall survival. So that's an example of what kinds of thing they wanted to trade off. And in their questions of trade-offs, they found that approximately 20% of patients said that they would endure significant side effects for a 2-month survival benefit. And 60% were willing to endure those same significant toxicities for a 1-year survival benefit. So that gave the committee some sense of what patients were willing to tolerate with this treatment. And of the patients who had had the new treatment, they found that it was less toxic and that they'd experienced fewer side effects from therapy. And they also asked them specifically about quality of life, which, as you heard from the trial results, those quality of life results were quite poor and, well, non-existent in the first submission, and then they resubmitted for another reconsideration. So these patients noted that their quality of life on this treatment was greater than 5. All of them said that. And I think what was interesting to note was the second quote: "My overall quality of life is about a 5, but since I started chemo, it has never been better than that. I certainly don't feel any worse. It's an oral chemo. I'm able to do more things rather than 2 hours at the hospital and 48 hours at home with a bottle of chemo infusions." That just shows you that in terms of context. Well, what does that mean? What does oral mean? Why is it valuable? And quality of life is already affected by previous treatments. So in 2018, when we first saw this drug, PERC did not recommend funding it because the results were inconsistent between trials, and at that time there was no quality of life data. So they resubmitted with health-related quality of life data. And again, PERC still found many limitations with the quality of the evidence, and we again did not recommend funding. And Colorectal Cancer Canada, as I said, had the opportunity to provide feedback, and they did, and they disagreed. And I think their objections highlight some of the problems that other patient groups have also expressed about the review process. And in particular, they highlighted that treatment, especially given the fact that the toxicities were manageable and were acceptable to them. And then the other big thing they said was that they felt that we should have taken into account the really hard work that they had done to gather patient data. So they referred to this as the real world evidence that they had gathered. And the fact that this evidence aligned with the health-related quality of life data presented in the trial. And that's, it's always an issue at PERC where we think, how do we weigh the patient evidence? Yes, they did a survey, but was it as rigorous as a clinical trial, and so on and so on. So it's often a debate, and we have had occasions where, in fact, the patient groups have found more patients and better data, without really analyzing it than appears in the trial. And it's a concern for patient groups. So in the end, I think this drug was a good example of how the patient groups helped PERC have a very much deeper understanding of the value of this drug to patients, their willingness to trade off certain kinds of outcomes versus the toxicities. They also felt very strongly that there was an unmet need for treatment. And although the recommendation was negative, PERC actually commended the patient group for their high quality decision and for providing, I have to say, a very vigorous debate at the committee. It was a very difficult drug. So for patient groups, there are many challenges in presenting to PCODER. There was a study done of 21 different patient groups who are registered with PCODER, and they reported that they view the opportunity to present to PCODER as an important and meaningful part of their activities. And they especially value the opportunity to provide information that's not available in trials, such as patient caregiver priorities, impact on quality of life, the context for some of those side effects. I remember one drug we had, the side effect was itchiness, and we were like, oh, well, itchy, okay. But in fact, what happened was patients said the itchiness was such a problem, they couldn't shower because water irritated them. And that meant they didn't want to go out, which then had an impact on their social lives. So that's the kind of information that we get. However, patient groups face many, many, many challenges in making submissions. First of all, anticipating submissions, the timelines are often quite tight. Patient groups don't operate to provide submissions to PERC. They have many other obligations, and in fact, it's usually an add-on. Making a submission is very challenging for them, particularly if the groups are small and volunteer-led. Sometimes they don't know with enough advance notice that its opportunity to submit is coming. And so they look for information from Health Canada, from FDA, from European agencies, or even from industry partners who often fund patient groups. They also pointed out that accessing scientific information is difficult because we can't afford to access this information. There's a paywall for them. And yet they felt it was really important for them to at least know what the key research is in order to develop appropriate questions when they consult with their patient groups, in order to reach appropriate patients, and in order to assess the validity of the feedback they get from their own patients. And that's particularly important for complex trials. They also have difficulty with patient outreach. Sometimes it's hard to explain, like, what is PCODER, why are we doing this? And patients aren't necessarily motivated to take part. They find it hard to reach diverse patients. And in general, it can be hard to engage patients because they're busy focusing on their treatment in their own way. And it can be hard to find patients who've had the review drug, especially when indications become much more narrow. It's a very resource-intensive process. They estimate it takes between 40 and 100 hours to prepare a PCODER submission. And there are costs to that. There may be opportunity costs if they have something else coming up that may divert their staff to do this. Some groups have actually paid extra. And then the whole problem of representing diverse experience, because every patient is different, and they complain that the PERC requires them to use and flatten out. So one person might have a terrible experience and one person have a positive one, or it may be somewhere in between, and it's very hard to convey that nuance. However, PCODER does try to support patients with, they have an excellent patient and community engagement team. They provide guidance for providing input. They have a template. There's an open calls page on the CADIS website to look for drugs that are coming up. And as I said, they've most recently begun posting examples of how the insights from patients and caregivers have been used in recent CADIS reviews. So circling back to costs, you've heard about the costs and the $100,000 price tag. PERC considers the cost effectiveness, but not the cost to patients. So for example, the oral drug that we were talking about, if you, depending on where you live, you may have to pay for that yourself. That's something we discuss at PERC, but it doesn't become part of the recommendation. And PERC makes decisions sequentially on individual drugs, and these drugs are increasingly expensive. And it's a huge problem for the healthcare system when it comes back to you. And as you can see from this quote from flirting to carousel, patients want the drugs. I mean, individuals do, and they want others. Well, I had the same dilemma after serving on PERC for 6 months. Much more aware of the cost of cancer drugs. And so after my surgery, when my team recommended the adjuvant pembrolizumab, I wasn't sure if it was a good idea because I knew that the evidence for the type of melanoma that I have is actually very poor because it's rare and hardly anybody's part of the trial. So it was a dilemma to me to know whether or not I should take this $100,000. But it's not really part of the discussion of informed consent, in my opinion, between patients and their clinicians, because I think often clinicians aren't aware of the full cost of the drugs. So it's something we can debate. And I would encourage any of you here who are members of patient groups to encourage your group to take part in the CADIS reviews, because it is really important to provide that context and background information so that better decisions can be made.